So welcome, Vivian Geiran. You're responsible for pulling together the guidelines of the Council of Europe on addressing radicalisation in prisons and finding solutions to tackle radicalisation in prisons. Why do we need guidelines?
Well, those people working in prisons and in probation services across Europe have always dealt with a wide variety of offenders. Clearly, in recent times, radicalisation has become a particular problem, particularly in relation to a number of outrageous attacks in various parts of Europe and beyond. These attacks have highlighted the problem of radicalisation, and prison and probation populations have been identified as two areas where offenders who have become or are becoming radicalised to violent extremism can be identified and interventions can be undertaken. So really the value of these guidelines is that the Council of Europe and its member states collectively are showing that we are all working together to identify, assess and deal with the problem of radicalisation, particularly as it occurs in prison and probation populations.
And is it a question of building on good practice, or what kind of form do the guidelines take?
Absolutely. The fundamental basis of the guidelines is, to put it simply, that good probation work and good prison work is and should be the foundation for how we respond to the problem of radicalisation and various other types of offending. So respect for fundamental human rights, but also practice that is based on good practice, proven, evidence-led decision making is the way forward and is the way to be effective in relation to addressing radicalisation.
And what are we talking about here? Because presumably you want to identify the radicals. Mm-hmm. Presumably you want to stop them radicalising others. What are the guidelines seeking to achieve?
Well, the guidelines set out a fundamental foundation for the way we work, which is based on existing good practice and respect for fundamental rights. They also identified then the key stages of the process. So, good risk assessment leading to good case management, and particularly the whole area of interagency cooperation and communication between the various criminal justice players, particularly, especially police, prisons and probation, is key to how we address this issue effectively.
So this is a kind of a process of people moving through the system and the agencies working together to pool their information, for example?
Absolutely, and the people who either are radicalised or are at risk or vulnerable to become radicalised are not all the same. They're not a homogenous group. They can be very diverse. Some of them can have a long history of offending, they can have mental health problems and so on, but others are much more difficult to spot in the first place because they come from what appear to be otherwise normal backgrounds. So really the staff that are dealing with the individuals concerned are key to the process, and it's essential that we have good staff training for people working in prisons, people working in probation, so that they know the signs that might identify that somebody is at risk of becoming radicalised, and also training that helps them to assess that person and to intervene appropriately.
And what are the kinds of guidelines with regard to the intervention? What can be done when somebody is identified as a radical?
The first step is that there has to be good communication. Within the prison context, the concept of dynamic security is essential. The prison officer working on the wing or the landing, who's interacting with prisoners every day, is a key person, for example, in relation to building good professional relationships, and those relationships can be further built to address issues that are related to radicalisation. We also, in the working group on penological cooperation, we are currently working on developing a further document, which is a set of practical guidelines, which will set out good practice and methods for working in the areas of screening offenders, risk assessment, case management, and providing interventions that should be useful to helping offenders to disengage from the radicalisation process.
And presumably there are a number of factors which will make it easier or harder to actually implement those practical guidelines. I'm thinking if you've got too many people in a prison, it must be harder to take effective action to separate radicals from people who might become radicalised. Are the guidelines addressing those issues?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So issues like overcrowding are key where overcrowding exists, it's important that we work as hard as we can to address that issue, to reduce and hopefully eliminate overcrowding in prisons, because the issues such as overcrowding and the conditions that prisoners have to live in and the regimes that they have to exist under are key to whether we can be as effective as we need to be in addressing radicalisation.
But what things can the prison administration actually do to stop radicalisation when they actually identify that it's happening? What are the practical measures that they can take?
Well, one key measure is that we have to work in a multi-agency and a multidisciplinary way. So, for example, in terms of risk assessment of offenders, whether they're in the community or in prison, needs to happen on a multi-agency and multidisciplinary way. And that includes not just criminal justice professionals like prison officers or probation officers, psychologists, social workers, but also religious chaplains who can have a key role to play in relation to particular types of offenders who may become radicalised.
And it sounds very simple, the way that it's presented like that. Is that not already happening in prison systems across Europe?
Oh, it is, absolutely. And in prison systems and probation systems across Europe, organisations do work in a multidisciplinary way. I suppose radicalisation has thrown up some particular problems, and the benefit and the value of these guidelines is that they show people how we can work in a collaborative way, how we need to build on the ways that we already do that, and how in that way we can be as effective as possible.
And then from the human rights point of view, a lot of pressure on member states, on administrations and governments to take action to stop, to fight terrorism, to fight radicalisation. Are there concerns that you may have, that the committee may have had or have with regard to human rights of individuals and how those guidelines might apply to their human rights?
There is a very fine and a very careful line that we need to draw between the rights of individuals to individual freedom, confidentiality, protection and so on, data protection issues, and the right of society generally to protect itself, and for us as criminal justice organisations to reduce the risk of bad things happening in society. Having said that, we fundamentally believe that the bedrock on which we need to base all our responses is respect for human rights. At a very practical level, if we put people in prison and we treat them in a very harsh way, and if that individual is already prone to or vulnerable to becoming radicalised, the harsher the treatment, the more likelihood that that process of radicalisation will be increased. So we do need to respond in a very robust and a very practical way, but we also need to ensure that we don't lose respect for fundamental rights.
Religious freedom, freedom of expression,
absolutely, data protection. All of those areas need to be protected and need to continue to be protected in our response to radicalisation.